Think about the Mughal courts for a moment. Marble, palaces, gardens, music, and poetry. But hidden in the records are small hints that raise a different question. How did same-sex love fit into this world? Some court chronicles mention emperors keeping young male attendants very close. Persian poetry in India often describes affection between men in language that sounds more than friendship. Miniature paintings show scenes of intimacy that later writers tried to explain away. At the same time, moral laws and religious voices condemned such acts, and many accounts were either erased or reshaped to look proper. So what do we do with these pieces? Were they signs of accepted relationships, or just art and poetry we read differently today? The truth is unclear. Which source would you trust more? The poetry, the paintings, or the court records? Share your pick and the time you're watching. And if you enjoy history told through open questions, you can subscribe, no pressure. Behind the Mughal palace's jeweled walls, the loudest stories were not always about emperors on thrones, but about whispers that drifted through the zenana, the women's quarters where rules bent and secrets nested like pigeons in the rafters. You walk slowly through corridors, smelling faintly of rosewater carpets, muffling your steps, and you realize the quiet here is misleading. The zenana was a world of its own, filled not just with wives and concubines, but with attendants, servants, musicians, and guards so many lives pressed together that affection and longing had to find new outlets. Imagine dozens of women cut off from the public world, their days scheduled around rituals, embroidery, music, and the occasional glimpse of the emperor, if fortune allowed. Boredom was as common as jewels, and boredom, as you know, breeds invention. Friendships deepened into something warmer. Confidences carried tones heavier than words admitted, and glances lingered longer than propriety dictated. No chronicler dared write bluntly about this, but oral traditions and stray memoir lines suggest bonds within the zenana were not always confined to polite sisterhood. Travelers sometimes dropped hints. European visitors invited into the palace only rarely wrote astonished accounts of the sheer number of women hidden within. They imagined jealous rivalries for the emperor's attention, yet missed the more human truth. Not every heart pointed toward the same man. It is almost comical, like watching someone assume every coworker in a large office has a crush on the boss, when in reality, they're often more interested in each other. The Mughal zenana was vast. Akbar's court alone housed hundreds of women, from noble brides to captured princesses to skilled artisans. They lived in close quarters, shared servants, and relied on one another for emotional sustenance. Think about it: when your movements are restricted, your world shrinks to those near you. Affection doesn't vanish, it redirects. And so behind ornate Jaroka screens, same-sex companionship quietly flourished, woven into the fabric of daily life. Court records occasionally trace slips. A noblewoman punished for disorderly conduct is never fully explained, but the severity suggests more than gossip. Poets within the harem compose couplets praising each other's beauty, cloaking affection in metaphors of flowers, moons, and rivers. Were these just aesthetic exercises? Possibly. But why did listeners laugh knowingly, as if catching a subtext language? In the zenana, operated like a double mirror, you saw yourself, but also the person beside you closer than rules allowed. Even emperors' mothers and wives, wielding great influence, could not fully police these bonds. Power flowed through intimacy, and sometimes intimacy did not match the official script. A senior consort might shower a junior with gift silks and private lessons in etiquette. On the surface, it was mentorship. underneath the attention carried shades of favoritism that others noted. Do you ever wonder why jealousy rises fastest, not at obvious threats, but at subtle ones? The Zenana's politics ran on such undercurrents. In one Persian chronicle, a story slips through about musicians in the women's quarters. They sang ghazals of longing lines that blurred whether the beloved was male or female. The audience knew, of course, but no one interrupted because poetry always gave cover. If you wanted to praise the curve of a cheek, you could do it with verse and let listeners interpret as they wished. This deliberate ambiguity turned art into shield, allowing women to express tenderness without direct accusation. You might compare it to a modern boarding school where students confined together form intense relationships that outsiders misunderstand. Letters from Mughal princesses show similar dynamics, references to companions whose absence caused pain sharper than swords lines that ring with personal emotion, even though clothed in polite metaphor. Historians often hesitate to label these as romantic, yet the emotional weight is hard to deny. When someone writes of sleepless nights waiting for a friend's return, the language outgrows mere camaraderie. The architecture itself played a role. The zenana was a maze of courtyards, small gardens, and shadowed rooms. Privacy was scarce, yet paradoxically, hidden alcoves existed everywhere, spaces just beyond a guard's line of sight corners, where two people could lean close under the pretense of conversation. Palaces are like cities. Their size creates opportunities for secrets. You feel it in the way sound travels. Whispers in one corridor vanish before reaching another, leaving pockets of freedom in a supposedly controlled world. You pause near a lattice screen, light falling in broken squares on the floor, and somewhere behind it, a laugh flares quick and hushed, leaving you unsure whether you were meant to hear it. You sit cross-legged on a cool marble floor, the air heavy with incense and ink, while a court poet unrolls a sheet of fine paper. His voice lilts as he begins to recite in Persian, the language of prestige, and then shifts into Urdu, the language of street and court alike. His words shimmer with metaphor, and you realize quickly that poetry in Mughal India was not just entertainment, it was camouflage. What could not be admitted openly was dressed in roses, moons, and nightingales until everyone listening could nod politely while smiling at the subtext. Ghazals, those tightly wound poems of longing, blurred gender with ease. A lover might be addressed as he in one line and she in another, and no one batted an eye. The ambiguity was intentional, a way to keep the door wide open. Poets like Sauda and Mir Taqi Mir painted desire in strokes so fluid that scholars today still debate whether the beloved they described was male, female, or deliberately both. Doesn't that sound familiar? You've probably heard a love song on the radio that never names the beloved's gender leaving room for every listener to imagine themselves in it. At court, the audience understood. A clever poet could recite verses before the emperor himself, praising beauty that might belong to a page or a princess, and no censor could quite pin him down. Everyone played along. To say the lines were just metaphors kept things safe, but to ignore their double meaning entirely would have been to miss the fun. Courtiers winked, laughed behind sleeves, and quoted favorite couplets in private conversations where the safe mask slipped away. The Mughal emperors encouraged this culture. Akbar loved debates and welcomed poets from across the empire. Jahangir adored Persianate sophistication and patronized writers who enriched his court with layered verses. Shah Jahan, famous for his Taj Mahal, was equally a patron of ghazals that drenched longing in imagery so lush you can almost taste the mangoes ripening in the metaphors. To them, literature was prestige, and prestige tolerated ambiguity so long as it was elegant. One poet described a boy cupbearer with cheeks like pomegranates split by the sun and lips stained redder than wine. To modern ears, it sounds bold, but in Mughal circles, it was art, not scandal. Wine fruit and gardens were stock images, but everyone in the audience recognized the heat behind the metaphor. You can almost hear the laughter ripple through the hall as the poet pauses for effect, everyone pretending to discuss horticulture while knowing better. Of course, some poets were braver. Mirza Ghalib, writing later under the fading Mughal shadow, carried that tradition with daring honesty. His letters and verses to male friends crackle with affection, teasing, and longing. He was not alone. Dozens of minor poets, their names half forgotten, filled anthologies with ambiguous affection that any attentive ear could decode. Isn't it striking how literature can preserve what official histories erase? The archives of power rarely mention intimacy, but the archives of verse sing of it endlessly. Poetry wasn't just for the elite. In bazaars, reciters performed couplets for coins, their verses winking at listeners who caught the second meaning. A traveler passing through could hear the same poem interpreted three ways depending on who stood in the crowd. The form was elastic, courtly, devotional, mischievous, and every time it played with pronouns, it cracked open a little more space for feelings people couldn't otherwise name. Think of how coded language still works today. People tweet lyrics instead of confessions, send memes instead of admissions, or forward songs to hint at feelings. Mughal poetry was the same, just with calligraphy instead of keyboards. The margins of manuscripts are filled with notes from later readers underlining lines that struck too close to the heart, proof that listeners centuries ago were playing the same game of recognition and concealment. The poet finishes, the ink dries, and the hall murmurs with approval. No one states plainly what was just heard, but everyone carries the lines away like a secret folded into silk. The paper will fade, but the words echo, looping back into conversations traded in courtyards, whispered in alleys, tucked into the fabric of memory where the safest truths always live. You follow the hum of voices into the durbar, the grand hall, where courtiers gather in silks that rustle like water. The emperor sits on a raised throne, jeweled canopy glittering overhead, but your eyes keep sliding away from him, to the young attendants who hover nearby. They pour wine, adjust cushions, fan peacock feathers, their movements so polished they seem choreographed. You notice how beauty itself was a form of service here, faces chosen as carefully as jewels, robes fitted with precision, every gesture designed to impress as much as to assist. In Mughal courts, youth and elegance carried currency. Male pages and attendants, often called khidmatgars, prized for their looks as much as their skill. Chroniclers sometimes compared them to cupbearers in Persian poetry, embodiments of both refinement and temptation. You can almost picture the knowing glances exchanged among older courtiers, half envy, half gossip, when the emperor's gaze lingered too long on a favored servant. Doesn't that remind you of modern workplaces, where proximity to the boss carries its own rumors, no matter how innocent the relationship? Human nature hasn't shifted much, only the costumes have. The durbar was not just politics, it was theater. Rows of nobles competed in loyalty. Poets improvised. Verses, musicians played delicate ragas. And in the middle of it, all the emperor relied on attendants who were as ornamental as they were practical. Some became confidants, learning secrets whispered between audiences. Others turned into symbols, their beauty woven into descriptions of the court itself. When travelers from Europe wrote home, they marveled not only at the wealth, but at the attendants who seemed too striking to be mere servants. One Portuguese visitor in Jahangir's reign described the court as a garden of young men in bloom. His words carried both admiration and unease. To him, beauty in male form being celebrated so openly felt unfamiliar, almost scandalous. Yet for the Mughals, steeped in Persian aesthetics, it was natural. Beauty was beauty, no matter who embodied it, and courts turned that recognition into spectacle. There were risks, of course. Attendants too favored could stir jealousy their closeness to the throne, threatening older courtiers. Stories surface of rivalries sparked not by policy, but by who carried the emperor's cup, who held his cloak, who lingered after audiences were dismissed. Politics and intimacy blurred until they were nearly the same language. Do you see the pattern? Where power concentrates affections never stay invisible for long. Some emperors encouraged this culture more than others. Jahangir, with his well-known love of wine, surrounded himself with cupbearers whose descriptions in his memoirs verge on affectionate detail. Aurangzeb, more austere, frowned on such indulgence, yet even his court could not erase the tradition. Whispered stories of favorites persisted tucked into the margins of records. You imagine the older courtiers muttering under their breath, pretending to disapprove while keeping one eye fixed on whoever stood closest to the throne. The aesthetics of the court reinforced this blurring. Robes of fine muslin clung lightly to skin jewelry glittered on wrists and ankles. Kohl-outlined eyes in ways that emphasized softness. Courtiers were as much visual art as political actors. To ignore the sensuality of the space would be to miss half the story. And yet official histories smooth these details away, preferring to talk of battles and decrees. It is the silences, once again, that reveal the most. Think of how celebrity culture works today. A star posts a photo with a friend, and the internet spins theories about the nature of the relationship. In Mughal India, the Durbar was the original stage for that same speculation. Who bowed closest? Who whispered at the emperor's ear? Who was gifted robes from the royal wardrobe? These small acts fueled rumors that traveled through bazaars as quickly as military victories. You glance again at the attendants, their silks shimmering under the chandeliers of crystal and oil. The emperor's eyes rest briefly on one, and the murmur of the hall stills for a second longer than usual. The courtiers cough, the musicians adjust, but you feel the tension ripple beneath the jeweled calm, a reminder that even in the grandest of halls, power and affection move together, quiet but undeniable. What if the most powerful man in India carried his heart where his scribes dared not follow? Some shadows in the Mughal palace were longer than the pillars, and they clung to stories that chroniclers hesitated to write down. You lean into one of those shadows, now listening to the gossip that rustled like silk in the courtyards. Emperors had favorites, and those favorites were not always chosen for politics alone. Rumors about Babur, the first Mughal emperor, lingered in his own memoirs. He wrote with startling honesty about a boy named Baburi, describing glances that shook him more than battles ever did. His words read like confession, wrapped in poetry. He could catalog military campaigns without a tremor, yet he admitted his heart raced when Baburi appeared. Imagine a conqueror who toppled cities but blushed like a teenager in his diary. Don't you find that disarming? Later courts kept quieter, but whispers persisted. Jahangir, for all his love of wine, and Nur Jahan was also said to keep close companions who stirred jealousy among courtiers. Shah Jahan remembered, for the Taj Mahal's romance did not escape whispers either. A few chroniclers hinted that his eye wandered in more directions than the marble symmetry suggests. None of these hints became official proclamations, but gossip rarely needs official sanction. It thrives on what is left unsaid. Favorites were rarely powerless. To be chosen as a confidant or companion meant access clothes from the royal wardrobe, jewels from the treasury, and most importantly, the emperor's ear. Resentment followed naturally. Courtiers who spent decades building reputations could find themselves overshadowed by someone younger, more charming, more intimate with the ruler. Politics sharpened its knives on jealousy, and history blurred the line between rivalry for influence and rivalry for affection. European travelers noticed, though, they often misunderstood. Some Portuguese and English envoys, raised on their own cultural anxieties, reported that Mughal courts indulged in unnatural practices, a phrase dripping with both scandal and vagueness. They could not quite admit what they saw, nor could they leave it unrecorded. Their reports, though biased, confirmed that relationships in the palace did not always fit their categories of propriety. Do you see how outsiders' discomfort often preserves truths insiders dared not write? Not all emperors handled it the same way. Aurangzeb, famously devout, cut off the culture of indulgence that flourished under his predecessors. Yet even his austere reign could not erase the memory of favorites in earlier courts. People whispered, still though more cautiously, as if protecting embers in a storm. The very need for silence suggests how deeply the stories ran. Poetry continued to play accomplice. Court poets praised attendants' beauty in verses so ornate they could be dismissed as metaphor. Musicians sang of loyalty and closeness, words that audiences weighed for double meanings. If you think of modern celebrity tabloids hinting at relationships with phrases like close friend or longtime companion, you grasp the tactic. Language gave everyone plausible deniability, while allowing rumor to flourish. The architecture of rumor is always delicate. It balances on hints, half smiles, sudden promotions, or inexplicable banishments. When a favored attendant disappeared from court records, people asked questions without speaking them. When a new face lingered near the throne, people adjusted their alliances. In this way, affection shaped politics not through declarations, but through the unsteady weight of suspicion. You stand at the edge of the durbar, the light catching the emperor's profile as he leans toward a favored companion. Courtiers pretend to study their rings. Scribes dip pens as if nothing unusual is happening. But everyone feels the air shift. You sense how power here was never only about swords or decrees. It also lived in glances and closeness, in shadows that history half recorded and half erased. You step out of the echoing durbar into the hush of a courtyard, where lamps flicker low and the sound of chanting drifts in the distance. The air feels different here, heavy with incense and devotion. This is the world of the Sufis, and longing takes a new shape in their shrines. Pilgrims bow, kiss the stone thresholds, and tie cloths to latticed screens as offerings. You realize quickly that the love sung here is not narrow. It stretches between the human and the divine. And in doing so, it leaves room for desires that do not always follow social rules. In Sufi poetry, the beloved is both God and human, a paradox that keeps verses alive with double meaning. A disciple might sing of yearning for his master, describing sleepless nights and a burning in the heart. Is it spiritual? Yes. Is it emotional? Undeniably. When Bulleh Shah or Amir Khusrau poured longing into couplets, they used language that listeners could easily interpret as both mystical and personal. The ghazal became a vessel where divine yearning and earthly desire swirled together until no one could quite separate them. Picture a circle of qawwali singers, palms clapping harmoniums, droning voices rising in unison. They chant of union, of dissolving into the beloved of joy, so intense it borders on pain. The audience sways, some weep openly, others slip into trance. To the casual eye, it is worship. To those inside it, the line between worship and intimacy blurs. Have you ever been at a concert where the music made you feel both overwhelmed and strangely close to the strangers swaying beside you? That is the energy here, only sanctified by shrine walls. Historical accounts record disciples who attached themselves completely to their Sufi masters, living at their side, serving them, writing poetry in their honor. Some relationships were remembered with a tenderness that sounds more like companionship than formality. A Mughal chronicler once noted with slight unease how certain disciples seemed drunk on love for their guides. He meant it as a metaphor for spiritual intensity, yet the phrasing suggests he had noticed the earthly tone too. The shrines themselves fostered this atmosphere. Unlike the rigid separation of the court, Sufi spaces welcomed everyone: merchants, nobles, women, men, travelers. People slept in courtyards, shared meals, and mingled in ways that loosened strict boundaries. In that looseness, same-sex affection could blend invisibly with spiritual fellowship. If someone embraced another too long, or whispered a private verse, it was written off as divine enthusiasm. The sanctuary of religion covered what society might otherwise question. The Mughals understood the power of these shrines. Akbar himself visited the Dargah of Salim Chishti and credited the saint with granting him heirs. Jahangir continued the tradition, offering gifts to Sufi centers. Yet for all their reverence, emperors also worried. Sufi orders inspired loyalty that sometimes rivaled the court's own power, and their language of love gave cover to bonds the palace could not fully regulate. Devotion created a parallel politics of intimacy, one carried not in decrees, but in sighs and songs. Folklore remembers the shrines as places of acceptance. A traveler who felt out of place in the bazaar could find welcome under the shrine's awning. Musicians, ascetics, and lovers of all kinds passed through, leaving scraps of verse carved into walls or whispered into the night air. Colonial officials later tried to categorize this devotion as superstition, missing how deeply it functioned as a safe space. Isn't it striking how sacred sites so often double as havens for those who live at society's edges? You linger as the chant reaches a crescendo. The harmonium wheezes, drums, pound voices, rise in ecstatic repetition. A young devotee cries out, falls to the ground, then rises smiling through tears. Around him, men clasp hands tightly. Women rock side by side, and the shrine pulses with shared emotion. You see how longing here doesn't need labels. It is vast, elastic, and safe beneath the veil of sanctity. You drift back into palace halls, where artists squat cross-legged with fine brushes grinding pigments from lapis and gold. The scent of glue and parchment fills the air. Miniature painters work in silence, their strokes precise enough to fit whole worlds into a palm-sized frame. You lean close and see how art says things plain language never dared. A glance held too long, a hand brushing another's sleeve. Two figures posed just a breath, closer than necessary, details that scribes omitted, but painters left for sharp eyes to catch. Mughal miniatures loved to borrow Persian motifs. In those older manuscripts, cupbearers with delicate features served wine with knowing smiles, while their masters gazed at them with unhidden admiration. The Mughals adopted and adapted that imagery. A painting might show a prince in a garden surrounded by attendants, one of whom looks back over his shoulder, with a face softened by affection. Officially, it is courtly elegance. Quietly, it is suggestion. Haven't you noticed how in modern advertising, a posed photo can hint at intimacy without ever stating it? Mughal painters mastered that centuries ago. Some albums commissioned by emperors show hunting scenes, battles, and portraits of rulers in stern profile. But tucked among them are private works commissioned for enjoyment, not display. In those pages, a young noble might be painted reclining with another youth, both framed by flowering vines. Scholars debate whether these scenes reflected actual relationships or simply aesthetic ideals. The ambiguity itself was useful. It let patrons appreciate the art without confessing too much. Take Jahangir's albums. Alongside portraits of himself with his empress, Nur Jahan, you find images of male attendants rendered with astonishing tenderness, fine lines tracing their hair, eyes outlined with kohl lips painted fuller than mere accuracy demanded. The artist lavished detail on them, and you wonder, was it simply beauty for beauty's sake? Or did the painter record something? Court poets were already singing in veiled metaphors. The workshops trained hundreds of artists, each apprenticed to a master. Together, they produced images that blended Persian subtlety with Indian richness. They were careful never to cross into scandal, yet they left space for interpretation. A viewer could glance quickly and see only grace, or linger longer and catch the tilt of a wrist, the softness of a gaze, the implication hidden in plain sight. That layered viewing is what kept the art alive. Even British collectors in later centuries noticed but struggled to name it. They cataloged such paintings as youths in garden or attendants with noblemen stripping away the tension. Their discomfort preserved the silence, yet the images themselves refused to vanish. They sit now in museums, their pigments still glowing, their secrets still visible if you look closely enough. Isn't it ironic how art survives as evidence even when words were erased? Common people also saw these miniatures. Copies circulated in bazaars, sometimes crudely drawn, but carrying the same motifs, close set pairs, languid poses, dreamy gardens. A villager buying such an image may not have called it romantic, but he recognized intimacy when he saw it. These pictures became conversation pieces, sly gifts, tokens that said more than the buyer admitted aloud. You lean over the shoulder of a painter as he dots gold leaf into a halo of light around two figures. His hand doesn't tremble, though his brush is thinner than a hair. To him, this is simply craft. To you watching centuries later, it feels like a record of what could not be spoken, a gallery of glances preserved in paint and paper, waiting for anyone willing to pause long enough to read between the brushstrokes. If palaces hid their secrets in silk and gold, marketplaces hid them in noise and laughter. The bazaar roared like a restless sea hawker's yelling prices, animals braying pots, clanging coins clinking against calloused palms. You squeeze past spice sellers and cloth merchants, catching snippets of gossip woven into bargaining cries. Hear love stories had no marble screens for cover, but they survived in alleys and caravanserais where no emperor's gaze reached. Picture a crowded inn along the Grand Trunk Road. Merchants and travelers share straw mats, snoring in overlapping rhythms. One reaches for another, in the dark no chronicler around to object. Such encounters rarely made it into official histories, yet they happened often enough for folklore to joke about them. Storytellers in villages winked when describing caravan life, hinting at friendships that kept men warm through long journeys. Isn't it striking how ordinary spaces leave no records, yet they may have held more truth than polished court memoirs, markets themselves created cover. In Delhi or Agra, stalls packed tight meant privacy was impossible, but anonymity was abundant. Two young men slipping into a crowd could disappear for hours without anyone tracing them. Women who visited bazaars with servants sometimes met companions under the cover of shopping trips. Songs sung by entertainers carried sly innuendo, teasing audiences who understood the jokes. If you've ever heard a street performer slide a cheeky line into an otherwise innocent song, you already know the tactic. Some Mughal-era folk tales remember such spaces vividly. One anecdote tells of a cloth seller who favored a particular customer so openly that others teased them as two threads from the same loom. Another describes a tavern in Lahore where travelers paired off and poets scribbled verses about bonds too brief to last but too strong to forget. These weren't official archives, but oral memory kept them alive, passed with chuckles over cups of chai. The bazaar also welcomed Hijras communities of gender non-conforming people who occupied an ambiguous space in Mughal society. They performed blessings at births and weddings, sang bawdy songs in markets, and lived together in ways that puzzled outsiders. While elite chronicles often ignored them, their presence in daily life was impossible to miss. They embodied a reminder that society's margins often held its most visible expressions of difference. Ordinary people interacted with them casually, while colonial observers, centuries later, fretted to categorize them. Travelers from abroad noticed this vibrancy. One Italian visitor described Indian bazaars as theaters of every passion, where music, flirting, bargaining, and mockery collided in constant performance. His words carried disapproval, but they confirm what locals already knew, that crowded alleys offered room for playfulness and risk. Just as in today's cities, anonymity in crowds gave freedom impossible in smaller villages. At night, caravanserais hummed differently. Fires burned, low wineskins passed hand to hand, and songs drifted from corner to corner. Journeys were long and affection bloomed in the pause between one road and the next. Folklore rarely judged these bonds. It shrugged, laughed, and folded them into the long story of travel. Bonds might dissolve by dawn, yet they left behind verses, nicknames, and inside jokes that traders carried home like souvenirs. You pause in a market alley, watching as two apprentices laugh too loudly at a private joke, their heads tilted close. The crowd swirls past them, no one stopping, no one caring. It is only one moment among thousands lost in the din. Yet moments like this, repeated endlessly in bazaars and inns, filled the spaces official scribes left blank. You feel the air tighten as the British arrive, their boots echoing against palace stones, their notebooks bristling with judgments. They look at Mughal customs with raised eyebrows, quills ready to translate ambiguity into crime. For centuries, poetry had offered cover shrines, had provided shelter markets, had buzzed with innuendo. Now, a new gaze insists on categories, one that stiffens labels and condemns. British administrators brought Victorian morality in their luggage, along with ledgers and penal codes. Where a gazelle once slipped easily between genders, they read it as indecent. Where an affectionate friendship at court had carried no punishment, they rewrote it as offense. The Indian Penal Code of 1860, modeled on British law, criminalized acts that Mughal chronicles had simply sidestepped with silence. Do you see how the power of law can turn whispers into liabilities? Overnight missionaries joined the chorus. They entered bazaars with tracts declaring shrine dances immoral, hijra blessings, scandalous, and court poetry corrupting. Their letters home painted India as a land in need of moral rescue. Yet their descriptions preserved what they tried to erase. They could not resist writing of hijras in processions, or of musicians singing ambiguous verses, or of travelers pairing off in caravan inns. Their shock became accidental evidence. This new scrutiny changed behavior. Families taught children to avoid certain jokes. Markets grew quieter about nicknames, and shrine songs lost some of their daring edge. Yet human bonds did not vanish. They adapted. People learned to signal in subtler ways through fragments of poetry quoted at the right time, through touches disguised as ritual gestures, through silences filled with meaning. Haven't you noticed how communities under pressure invent new codes faster than censors can break them? The irony is sharp. British officers themselves often relied on Indian attendants and companions, sometimes keeping relationships they condemned in writing. Diaries reveal contradictions, with one page railing against native immorality and the next describing a favored orderly with surprising warmth. Hypocrisy was as common as stiff collars. The difference was that the British claimed the power to criminalize others while excusing themselves. Mughal traditions of ambiguity poetry, performance innuendo, offered resistance. People continued to sing verses where gender blurred to laugh at jokes too sly for outsiders to catch, to tell stories in which affection appeared as loyalty, never scandal. These strategies kept memories alive under the weight of law. Think of it as hiding seeds in dry earth. They wait, they endure, and when the rains shift, they sprout again. The colonial project tried to flatten diversity into neat Victorian categories. But beneath that flattening daily life in bazaars, shrines, and households still carried the pulse of older rhythms. Even when people lowered their voices, the echoes remained impossible to stamp out completely. You watch a missionary close his notebook, convinced he has cataloged everything, and yet the smile between two companions slips past his ink unnoticed. You notice how memories linger even after laws and rulers change. The Mughals may have lost their thrones. The British may have drawn lines in law books, but in songs, stories, and family anecdotes, echoes of queerness survived. You hear it in a grandmother humming an old thumri that never names its beloved, leaving the listener free to imagine. You hear it in a village storyteller chuckling as he recalls two friends who never married, a phrase loaded with more than nostalgia. Folk music carried some of the strongest traces. Ballads sung in villages often featured companions traveling together, swearing loyalty that outlived even wives and sons. The language was coded enough to pass as devotion, but listeners smiled knowingly. In Punjabi and Urdu songs, the beloved's gender often slipped the pronouns, dancing just enough to keep the meaning wide open. Have you ever caught yourself singing along to a love song on the radio and realizing it works no matter who you picture? That's the same trick, only centuries older. In theater, echoes persisted too. Nautanki and folk plays used cross-dressing not just for comedy, but to blur roles of affection. A man playing a woman could declare love to another man on stage, and audiences would laugh, but also let the scene sink in. The performance created a safe bubble where possibilities flickered before vanishing back into everyday roles. It's not so different from modern drag shows, where humor opens the door for deeper reflections. Some Mughal courtiers' names slipped into proverbs remembered less for their politics than for their rumored attachments. These stories were told at weddings or festivals, half as jokes, half as warnings. A bride's aunt might mutter, "Remember the favorite who forgot his emperor," the meaning left hanging for others to interpret. Oral history thrives on these sly references, never spelling things out, yet never forgetting them either. Even in family gossip, traces remained. Old letters found in trunks sometimes revealed affectionate exchanges between men who called each other soul companions. Their descendants preserved the letters without always admitting their depth, describing them simply as very close friends. In truth, these papers served as quiet heirlooms of bonds the law tried to erase. Isn't it remarkable how the most fragile things, scraps of paper, half-sung verses, can outlast empires? Hijra communities also preserved continuity. Though colonial law marginalized them, their songs, blessings, and ceremonies carried older Mughal echoes. Families still called them to bless newborns or weddings, partly out of tradition, partly out of lingering awe. Their very survival testified to a cultural memory that refused to disappear. You imagine sitting at a village gathering where an elder begins reciting a tale. The crowd chuckles at his sly phrasing, children lean in, and no one writes it down. Centuries from now, scholars may never find the details in archives, yet the memory breathes in that moment. Echoes are stubborn like that. They hide in laughter, in songs, in the pauses of speech. And even when history tried to muffle them, they found ways to hum on. Silence can be heavier than marble domes or fortress walls. You lie back now as if under that weight, thinking of all the voices that spoke in poems, glances, songs, and rumors, then fell quiet when scribes refused to record them. What survives of Mughal intimacies is like smoke after incense faint, but stubborn clinging to fabric long after the fire is gone. Colonial laws tightened the silence, and families often carried it forward, teaching children not to ask certain questions about too close friends or about hijras at weddings. Yet memory is slippery. A joke at a bazaar stall, a miniature painting tucked in a museum drawer, a couplet murmured in a song they all resist forgetting. Doesn't it make you wonder how much of history is really just what someone chose not to erase? You think of Babur, confessing his blushes in his memoir of Jahangir, surrounding himself with companions who stirred whispers of shrines where longing blurred between God and disciple of bazaars, where anonymity gave cover of British notebooks, turning desire into crime. Each fragment pulls against silence. None are whole stories, but together they remind you that lives were lived fully, even when described only in half shadows. What if forgetting was always the greater danger than scandal empires rose and fell? But the risk that memories might dissolve into dust was the real erasure. And yet here you are, centuries later, still able to glimpse those faint outlines, still able to laugh at the slyness of a ghazal, or to lean close to a miniature painting and catch the secret in a gaze. History does not give you closure here. It gives you fragments, echoes and silences heavy enough to make you drowsy. You listen to them as if they were lullabies from another century. The bazaar noise fades. The qawwali chanting softens, the emperor's durbar dissolves into shadow. All that remains is the steady hum of memory, stubborn and unbroken, pressing gently against the silence as you drift into sleep. Behind jeweled walls and marble halls, hidden affections shaped Mughal India in ways official chronicles refused to admit through poetry that blurred gender whispers in harems and rumors that clung to emperors themselves. What survives is not scandal, but fragments of intimacy woven into songs, stories, and art. And if those secrets linger in shadows, what of the rulers who live surrounded by desire and power every day? Now you turn toward the secret lives of Mughal emperors and their harems. The gates close behind you with a thud that sounds heavier than stone. It's the sound of entering a world few ever see. Moonlight paints the red sandstone walls in silver streaks, and you realize this is no ordinary doorway, but the threshold to a secret city within the palace. The Mughal emperors called it the Zenana, the harem. Yet it is not just a collection of rooms. It is a fortress of whispers, screens, and rules. You step forward, and suddenly the air itself feels perfumed, thick with rosewater and incense, as if scent is the first guard you must pass. Doesn't it strike you as strange how something meant to be hidden is also designed to dazzle every sense? The corridors twist like riddles. Latticed windows jolly cast patterns of light and shadow that dance across the marble floors. Through one screen, you catch the faint sound of anklets like coins chiming softly, though you see no one. That is the rhythm of this place, women moving behind veils, presence without exposure. Imagine today, walking into a celebrity's private backstage lounge. You'd know you were close to glamour, yet separated by layers of velvet rope. That same mixture of nearness and distance is what defines your every step here. The emperor himself rarely enters casually. Even he treats the Zenana like sacred ground. Historical records describe Akbar and Jahangir visiting during select hours, accompanied by attendants who recorded every movement. The women's world was both protected and policed, watched over by strict hierarchy. For a new entrant like you, every glance, every bow, every silence counts. The eunuchs at the gates, dressed in crisp garments, are the invisible traffic lights. They decide whether the emperor's favorite concubine strolls past or whether a maid fetches water. You wouldn't dare ignore them, not when they hold the power of passage. You wander deeper, and the architecture itself tells a story. Walls are painted with floral motifs, colors muted by lamplight, yet alive with symbolism. These weren't random decorations. The designs often carried Persian and Central Asian influences, reminders that the Mughal Empire was a cultural melting pot. Red sandstone meets white marble, just as Turco-Mongol roots met Indian soil. Its history whispered through pigment and stone. Have you ever noticed how in your own home, the wallpaper curtains, even the knickknacks, silently reveal what kind of person lives there? Multiply that 100-fold, and you begin to see how the Zenana spoke for its royal occupants. But let's not imagine this as only a serene, perfumed sanctuary. Under the moon, the harem is also a space charged with tension. The women here are not simply passive figures. Many are princesses, political hostages, or widows of defeated rulers brought into the Mughal fold as part of alliances. Gulbadan Begum Babur's daughter and chronicler wrote with candor about life behind these walls. She revealed how the women wielded influence in subtle ways, nudging the emperor's ear-shaping decisions that echoed far beyond marble arches. You realize quickly that behind the curtains, power is a soft hand that presses firmly in unseen directions. Now you pass a courtyard where the moon reflects in a shallow pool. The water shimmers, and you notice how the architecture ensures that no angle offers a full view. Privacy is designed into the very bricks. In modern terms, it's like the privacy mode on your phone, but here, it's carved into marble, calculated to perfection. One step too far, and you lose sight of the figure you were following. One wrong turn, and you end up in a chamber you weren't meant to see. The labyrinth itself keeps secrets safe. Near the pool stands a tall lamp, its flames guarded from the wind by glass panels. The light flickers, revealing painted niches filled with perfumes, mirrors, and jewel boxes. This is not only a living space, it's a display of wealth and refinement, a subtle message to any visitor royalty lives here. Think about it. Even the act of lighting a lamp was political theater proof that luxury could outshine darkness. At the far end, you hear faint laughter, the kind that makes you pause and wonder what story is being shared. Perhaps it's a joke about a pompous courtier, or gossip about which consort wore the heaviest necklace that day. Mughal chronicles often downplayed this side, but let's be honest, where groups of people live together, gossip is currency. Isn't it the same in modern offices where the break room whispers sometimes matter more than the official memos? Then a curtain sways stirred by the night breeze. A figure appears for a second, a silhouette framed by candlelight, and vanishes back into velvet folds. That fleeting glimpse is enough to remind you that this world is alive, pulsing with human drama. You wonder, are these women prisoners of luxury, or queens of their own stage? The truth, as you will keep discovering, lies somewhere in between. The pool's surface ripples as if echoing your unease, and as you step away from it, you realize your night in the Zenana has only just begun. You wake the next morning, with sunlight trickling through latticed screens, painting tiny diamond-shaped spots across your blanket. The air is cooler than the night before, though still laced with the faint sweetness of sandalwood. The Zenana does not roar to life like a bazaar. It hums quietly but firmly, with the kind of discipline that makes you realize you are inside a living system. Rooms stretch in every direction, courtyards stacked like layers of a puzzle, and every screen seems to say, "Look, but not too much." You rise and notice how space itself dictates behavior. A wide courtyard is flanked by small chambers, each meant for women of varying rank. The emperor's favored consorts enjoy chambers closer to the center, lavish with carved pillars and painted ceilings. Farther away are simpler quarters for lesser wives, servants, and attendants. It's as if architecture itself keeps score, silently reminding everyone of their position. Doesn't it remind you of modern office layouts, where the corner offices with windows go to the executives while interns sit near the printers? Everywhere you look, screens, jolly, carved in marble sandstone or wood divide and disguise. They are not just decorative. They ensure women can watch processions, festivals, and even military parades without ever being seen. The play of visibility and invisibility is constant, almost like the rules of a game you are still learning. You wonder, does being unseen give freedom or take it away? History doesn't hand you a neat answer. The rules here are subtle but sharp. A raised eyebrow, a pause before answering, or even the way someone adjusts a veil. All are signals in this code of conduct. Eunuchs and senior attendants act as referees, ensuring nothing breaks the delicate balance. When foreign travelers like François Bernier visited the Mughal court in the 17th century, they were struck by how invisible the women remained and how strictly their movements were guarded. To him, it was exotic, even baffling. To the women who lived it, it was daily rhythm. And yet discipline did not mean silence. Conversations flow like water between rooms. You hear chatter about a consort's new jewelry, another about her brother's promotion in the army. Political information leaks and spreads in ways no chronicler ever fully captured. Behind those lattice screens, women knew what was happening outside sometimes before the men in court did. It's a reminder that power is not always visible, but it certainly circulates. Walking further, you stumble into a small side hall where rules turn into ritual. The women line up for morning routines, a wash of prayer, a breakfast of fruit and spiced milk. There's rhythm, but also competition. Who wears the most fragrant attar? Who has a new silk dupatta? These details matter because in a world where your hidden expression comes through the smallest visible cues, a polished fingernail or a gold-threaded sari can whisper louder than a shout. The hierarchy here is rigid, but not without cracks. There are records of concubines and even servants rising in influence through wit charm or the emperor's favor. You recall Nur Jahan Jahangir's wife, who rose so high she issued coins in her own name. Her journey began in spaces like these where rules could be both ladder and trap. Do you think she felt the weight of those screens, or did she see them as stepping stones? From the courtyards, you wander into a corridor leading to a private garden patch. It is not large, but designed with intent. Pomegranate trees and jasmine bushes lean over marble paths, their scent filling the air. Women step lightly their veils, brushing flowers, while attendants fan them with peacock feathers. The gardens served not only as leisure spots, but as social theaters. Alliances were hinted at here. Rivalry sparked with a sideways glance. Doesn't it sound familiar to how modern coffee shops work as social hubs, where friendships and deals form quietly over cups of cappuccino? And then there are the silences. Not every corner buzzes with chatter. Some chambers echo with nothing but the shuffle of slippers. Those silences carry meaning too. The weight of waiting, of anticipation of lives where choice was limited. Chroniclers didn't always record it, but you can feel it in the walls, in the way light refuses to fill some spaces fully. As you step back into the main courtyard, you notice the layers of space rooms, screens, gardens, corridors, all folding into one another like origami. The Zenana is not just a place. It is an intricate stage where visibility, status, and silence choreograph daily life. The first sound of the day is not a trumpet or a shout, but the hiss of steam rising from copper cauldrons. Dawn in the Zenana is a ritual of water and scent. You are ushered into a long chamber lined with marble, where attendants carry buckets of warm water, laced with rose petals, sandalwood, saffron. Imagine a spa menu, but 5 centuries ago, and supervised with military precision. The bath is not only about hygiene, it is about hierarchy. The favored wives and concubines bathe first their attendants, whispering prayers while rubbing fragrant oils into their hair. Those lower in rank wait their turn, determined by invisible rules everyone understands, but nobody explains. You notice how even the fragrances are assigned like uniforms. Musk for one, jasmine for another, camphor for prayer days. Smell becomes identity. In a world where women are hidden from public gaze, scent is a form of presence drifting through screens and courtyards, announcing someone's arrival before her veil even lifts. Doesn't it remind you of how a colleague's perfume or cologne lingers in an elevator, long after they step out. The effect is the same, invisible, yet unmistakable. After the baths, prayer mats are rolled out. The quiet recitation of dawn prayers hums across the chambers, a harmony of devotion. Yet prayer is also a way of anchoring status. The emperor's mother, for instance, would sometimes lead gatherings where women recited together, reinforcing her authority as both matriarch and spiritual guide. Historical records describe how Hamida Banu Begum Akbar's mother carried immense respect in such moments. Her presence was like gravity, silent but undeniable. You sense how the harem is both sanctuary and stage, where discipline cloaks itself in piety. Breakfast arrives on silver trays, flatbreads, sweetened milk, and fruits polished to gleam like jewels. Attendants distribute portions with care, though not everyone receives the same. Again, hierarchy whispers through something as simple as melon slices. Do you think anyone dared to complain? Probably not aloud, but gossip, once again, flows sharper than any knife. Then come the cosmetics. The women sit before polished brass mirrors, while attendants grind coal-crushed sandalwood and mix henna. Beauty here is not frivolous. It is strategy. Kohl outlines eyes, not only for allure, but also for supposed medicinal benefit, believed to strengthen vision. Henna stains fingers and feet, a sign of refinement and readiness for festivals. Even the act of applying oil to hair carries meaning. This crown is sacred, one might whisper, echoing beliefs that hair held both dignity and spiritual force. Doesn't it sound like the way modern influencers turn morning routines into rituals, claiming every step is a path to empowerment? For these women, it was survival through presentation. You wander to another chamber where discipline takes the form of craft. Young girls practice embroidery, their needles stitching not just flowers into silk, but also patience into character. Others copy poetry, reciting verses aloud to improve memory and diction. A tutor, often an older woman of learning, oversees the process. Education was not uniform in the harem, but many women became surprisingly well-read. Some even composed poetry that slipped quietly into court circles. These routines were not merely hobbies, they were preparation for influence. A woman who could quote Sadi or compose a ghazal had sharper tools than jewelry ever provided. Yet the routine is also about control. By filling the hours with baths, prayers, lessons, and crafts, the structure prevents idleness, and idleness in such a charged environment could easily breed mischief. Bernier, the French traveler, noted how carefully the women's time was managed, as though the rhythm itself was a leash. But do you wonder if some women bent the rhythm, sneaking in a private letter or stolen nap? Human nature always resists perfect order. Mid-morning, you hear faint laughter spilling from a side courtyard where young attendants test perfumes and debate which blend the emperor might prefer. The air smells like a contest rose versus amber versus oud. These debates are playful, but they also train the women to anticipate imperial moods. A whiff of sandalwood could mean piety, a burst of rose could soften temper. Think of it as emotional intelligence, scented in liquid form. The hush returns as musicians rehearse soft ragas in another chamber. Not yet. Performance time, just warm-ups, a sitar's pluck, a tabla's tap. The sound threads through corridors like a reminder that discipline does not smother art, it frames it. The emperor might call for music at any hour, and the women must be ready, their skills polished like mirrors. By noon, routines slow. The baths have cooled, perfumes settled, lessons paused. The zenana seems calm, yet you now see how every ritual is both cage and ladder. What looked like luxury, the oils, the silks, the silver trays, is also discipline disguised. You realize that in this world, daily order is not simply about comfort, it is about control, and control is always political. The gate may look like wood and brass, but the true walls of the harem are living eunuchs who stand like breathing locks, unblinking keys in human form. Without them, no one enters, no one leaves, and no secret remains uncounted. You see them posted at thresholds, their expressions neither warm nor cruel, just unreadable. And you realize, in a place built on veils, they are the final veil. Their roles stretch far beyond guard duty. Each eunuch keeps ledgers recording movements, deliveries, and requests. Who visited which chamber, who received a new sari, who asked for more saffron, all of it noted with precision. It feels less like a household and more like a bureaucracy, except instead of filing cabinets, there are memories that never fade. Some carried reputations for recalling conversations word for word, even years later. Imagine your building's doorman, knowing not just your visitors, but also your shopping list, your bedtime, and your favorite music. That's the level of surveillance here. They were also confidants. Some women entrusted letters to them. Others sought their advice. The trust was delicate, born out of necessity. With no families nearby, eunuchs became the closest thing to allies. They acted as messengers between the women and the emperor, their words carrying weight like diplomatic dispatches. It was said that Shah Jahan, the builder of the Taj Mahal, relied heavily on reports whispered by these watchmen. Doesn't it fascinate you how those who never sat on thrones still shaped the empire from its shadows, but guardianship carried fear? Punishments for betrayal were severe, and eunuchs themselves were tightly monitored. They lived in a paradox, trusted deeply, yet never fully free. Some rose to extraordinary influence. One such figure was Idamid Khan during Akbar's reign, who managed vast sums and commanded respect even from nobles. When you picture eunuchs only as background figures, you miss that they sometimes directed entire currents of power. The daily rhythm of their presence is unavoidable. You sit by a courtyard pool, sipping spiced buttermilk offered by an attendant, and you notice a eunuch's eyes watching silently from the archway. No words are spoken, but the message is clear. Nothing escapes their notice. It's like living under constant CCTV centuries before electricity. Do you think the women grew used to it, or did they always feel that invisible weight pressing at their backs? At night, the role shifts. They patrol corridors, oil lamps in hand, checking doors, ensuring the hush holds. Their steps echo like a metronome across marble, a reminder that discipline does not sleep. And yet, in quieter moments, some offered music or stories to the younger attendants, easing homesickness with folk songs. This duality, guardian and comforter, defined their existence. Foreign travelers often wrote of them with fascination, sometimes disdain. Bernier once again described their loyalty as almost frightening, though he admitted their efficiency was unmatched. Jesuit missionaries visiting Akbar's court were stunned by the sheer organization these guardians enforced. Without them, the harem would collapse into chaos. With them, it thrummed like a tightly wound instrument. But their power was not just about order. It was also about access. When a eunuch delivered a message from a favored wife to the emperor, he could alter its tone, add a word, or withhold it entirely. Imagine the leverage a misplaced pause could decide whether a festival was funded or a noble punished. History rarely names them, but their fingerprints smudge every decision. Standing before one, now you notice his posture, calm, immovable, yet quietly commanding. The silk sash across his waist signals authority. The keys clinking softly at his side remind you that freedom here is never absolute. And as you turn back toward the women's chambers, you realize the eunuchs are not merely gatekeepers of walls. They are gatekeepers of destiny. The day drifts into a slower rhythm, and you find yourself in a long hall, brightened by filtered sunlight, where voices rise not in gossip, but in recitation. Young girls sit cross-legged their tutors, guiding them through lines of Persian poetry, repeating verses until the cadence seeps into memory. You lean against a carved pillar listening, realizing that education here is not a luxury, but a necessity. To charm the emperor, or to hold one's place in the hierarchy, requires wit as much as beauty. Isn't it striking how even behind locked gates the mind is trained as carefully as the body? Lessons extend beyond poetry. Some women practice calligraphy, their reed pens scratching on paper with slow precision, each curve of a letter like a miniature performance. Others rehearse music, plucking sitar strings or testing their voices against ragas meant to soothe or excite. The arts are weapons here, though no one would call them that aloud. Imagine being able to silence rivals not with a sword, but with a song so moving it lingers in the emperor's ear for days. That was the subtle battlefield of the harem. As evening approaches, the hall transforms. Lamps are lit, their flames flickering behind colored glass, casting jewel-like patterns across the floor. Attendants roll out carpets, musicians tune their instruments, and dancers begin to prepare. You are pulled into the velvet-lit world of performance, where every note and gesture carries meaning. A glance held too long can hint at rivalry. A perfectly timed verse can elevate someone in the emperor's favor. Isn't it similar to today's award shows, where applause, costumes, and timing can change careers overnight? When the emperor enters, the atmosphere shifts. Silence falls for a heartbeat before music resumes, richer, sharper. Historical accounts note how Akbar enjoyed these performances not only for entertainment, but also to gauge the talents and temperaments of the women around him. A song sung well might lead to a new alliance. A clumsy misstep could relegate someone to obscurity. This was not just entertainment, it was a living audition. Yet the performances were more than competition. They also wove culture into the palace. Persian ghazals, Indian ragas, Central Asian dances all collided in one room, turning the harem into a laboratory of fusion long before the word globalization existed. Think about it. The music that floated through these chambers was centuries ahead of Spotify playlists, blending genres. Here, the blend was lived, not streamed. Among the performers, you notice figures who carry more than talent. They carry stories. Nur Jahan, before rising to become Jahangir's powerful empress, was famed for her grace in poetry and song. Jahanara Begum Shah, Jahan's daughter, wrote Sufi-inspired poetry that mingled devotion with artistry. Their skills were not footnotes. They were the very tools that lifted them into influence. Watching the performances now, you understand that each note is a step on a staircase that leads either to obscurity or to power. The hall grows warmer as dancers move in rhythm, anklets jingling, veils flowing. The emperor nods, attendants whisper, and you feel the tension under the beauty. Everyone here knows that tonight's entertainment is tomorrow's rumor. A misplaced lyric could spark speculation. A dazzling performance could shift affections, and affections could ripple into political consequences. The harem is less a prison and more a stage where each player rehearses for survival. And when the night deepens, the music softens into lullabies, the dancers retreat, and lamps burn lower. You step back into the corridor, ears still ringing with verses, realizing that in this world, art is never just art. It is influence sung in silk and smoke. By now, you can read the air as well as any page. And the air tonight smells faintly of a tar and wet ink. Someone is writing. Not aloud, not publicly, but with that careful pressure that leaves no blot and ideally no trace. Letters here move the way cats move, silent, self-assured, and only seen if they want to be. You learn the roots, a folded slip tucked beneath a tray of pomegranates, a ribbon-wrapped note stitched into a pillow seam, a message murmured to a eunuch who will repeat it exactly only to the intended ear. In a palace where doors are watched and footsteps counted, affection survives by learning to whisper in codes. Ink becomes the companion of feeling. A line of poetry stands in for a confession. A proverb stands in for a promise, and a quotation from Saad or Hafiz doubles as camouflage. If anyone asks, it was just literature, wasn't it? You see the trick. The safest way to say, I'm thinking of you, is to claim you're thinking of books. In that sense, love in the Mughal world wears a scholar's robe. The letters carry the cadences of Persian ghazals, the discipline of calligraphy, the hush of midnight corridors, where a single creak can undo a month of planning. Have you ever typed a message, hovered over send, and then rewritten it 3 times, so it says everything and gives away nothing? Same impulse, different ink. Eunuchs make or break this traffic. Their hands remain neutral, their memories never. A trustworthy guardian can conduct a symphony of notes without dropping a beat. An untrustworthy one can crumple an entire future with a shrug. It isn't merely romance they ferry. Sisters warn brothers at court. Mothers advise sons. Senior ladies lobby for stipends, for pardons, for the repositioning of a cousin in the imperial household. In a sprawling empire, the fastest road from heart to throne sometimes runs through a narrow passage watched by a silent figure with a key ring. Rumor, meanwhile, travels faster than any letter. Letters need ink and resolve. Rumors need only a breath. You watch how a look at supper becomes a sentence by bedtime and a scandal by dawn. One attendant sees a shawl draped twice around someone's shoulders. Another swears it was a token. A third insists the token carried meaning. No malice needed, only boredom, curiosity, and the natural human talent for embroidery. The irony is sharp. In a place full of skilled embroiderers, nothing is embroidered more often than the truth. History doesn't record every note slipped beneath a carpet, but it does reveal outcomes shaped by gossip. Think of how Jahangir's early years were dogged by talk about loyalties, whispers, doubts, and the volatile fortunes of nobles around him. Consider how Nur Jahan later navigated a court that rarely admitted a woman's plain voice. She learned to make her requests emerge as if they were the emperor's own ideas. That alchemy relies on the same tools you see in the Zanana messenger timing. Even Jahanara Begum Shah Jahan's daughter had to cultivate her circle poet Sufi's senior attendants so that what she wanted said could be said by others without pointing back to her. If you're thinking this sounds like modern leaks to friendly journalists, you're not far off. The craft of lettermaking turns practical. Paper, often burnished to a sheen, is scented lightly so that each unfolding releases a fragrance cue telling the receiver exactly whose world they're entering. Seals matter a crushed wax rosette, a pressed floral mark, a private cipher. Some write on tiny slips designed to be rolled and hidden inside bangles. Others keep a formal hand for official requests and a looser, more breathing script for the personal. You can tell when someone's heart outran her training. There's a flourish where there should have been restraint, a doubling of a consonant, a line that curves too near the margin. Yet letters are fragile and have natural enemies: smoke water, lantern flame, and worst of all, interpretation. A line meant as comfort becomes in someone else's reading a claim. A metaphor becomes evidence. An honorific becomes a boast. The best writers learn to salt their lines with ambiguity, and the bravest readers learn to burn the page after memory has memorized it. Have you ever reread an old message and realized you projected half its meaning onto it? Multiply that by the stakes of inheritance, dowries, and rank, and you begin to understand the peril of paper in palaces. You notice, too, how affection adopts disguises that pass inspection. A pair of embroidered slippers arrives as a gift from a senior lady to a younger one, but the pattern on the toe tulip bent toward tulip belongs to a private alphabet learned between them. A tray of candied rose petals is sent to a relative recovering from illness, but the number of petals signals a time and place for a conversation during prayers. The palace with all its guards becomes a board game. The pieces are courtesies, and the winner is the one who makes kindness move like a rook. Sometimes rumor and letter collide. A whisper stirs. A note tries to correct it, and the rumor, now flattered by the attention, doubles in size like pastry in an oven. This is when you see how older, women mothers of princes' aunts, with long memories, earn their reputation as stormbreakers. A single public kindness, an invitation to share a garden seat, a remark praised within earshot of those who spread the tale, can puncture a ballooning story without naming it at all. The technique is timeless: address the weather, not the rumor, and everyone decides the sky was always clear. Your ear, trained by now to weigh the tone behind every syllable, catches a soft recitation from a nearby arch. Zeba Nissa's verses, someone murmurs, the learned daughter of Aurangzeb, who wrote under the pen name Makfi the Hidden One. Whether a specific ghazal of hers is being quoted, or a line attributed to her, this too is part of palace life. Poetry launders truth. It makes private emotion sound like universal wisdom, and allows a personal ache to be carried openly as respectable culture. When someone quotes a verse about patience and distance, you can't tell whether she's meditating or sending a message. Maybe both. You may wonder, did the emperor know? Of course he did. Emperors tend to. The wiser ones let harmless notes flutter and only swat at the flies that carried disease. Akbar's tolerance had a way of turning rumor's heat into steam that rose and vanished. Jahangir, fond of narrative, sometimes allowed himself to be charmed by the better-told version. Shah Jahan, whose love story is built into stone, understood that hearts will have their corridors. The line between oversight and overreach, though, is thin. A sudden search, a curt order, and the whole correspondence network freezes ink, drying in wells while eyes study the floor. If you're keeping a modern scorecard affection, here is a group project with many editors. The small courtesies of the day: who bows, who lends, who quotes which poet at which hour, aren't filler. They're footnotes in a larger argument about trust. And when occasionally a promised letter fails to arrive, you feel the absence like a door that should have opened and did not. Silence, too, is a message. It can mean safety or surrender or simple caution while a gust of gossip passes. Which would you read it as if you were the one waiting. Much later, when lamps thin and the palace rehearses its nightly hush, you catch the brush of fabric and the soft clink of a seal stamp returning to a small lacquered box. Someone has finished writing. Another has finished not writing. The moon climbs indifferent. In the morning, the corridors will pretend they are only corridors. Tonight, they carry a library no archivist will ever fully catalog. Color explodes like a coup. You step into a courtyard where holy powder bursts in clouds of pink and saffron, and you realize festivals here aren't just parties. They're negotiations, disguised in flowers and sweet syrup. Music rushes your ears, trays flash with marigolds and lattice, and the harem's careful hush loosens into laughter that still knows how to watch itself. You smell rosewater 1 second, cardamom the next, and beneath it, all the warm iron scent of authority. Because every celebration in this palace is a message. Holy in the Mughal world is choreography rather than chaos. Akbar sets the tone by welcoming spring revels with a statesman's half-smile letting color bridge faiths, while eunuchs stand at the margins like calm lifeguards. Screens are tied back, not fully just enough for delight to travel, without losing its manners. A playful smear on a wrist is also a sentence in a language of rank. We share the same season, even if our cushions sit at different distances from the center. If your office ever held a fun day that somehow decided bonuses, you already understand the script. Aid recenters the calendar with quiet symmetry. The courtyard trades pink powder for polished white fresh garments, silver dishes, dates that gleam like small moons. Morning prayer lifts every face in the same direction, and after it stipends and gifts move like a second liturgy. Purses of coin bolts of silk and the robe of honor the killat flow to hands the emperor wants to warm. If your boss handed you a tailored jacket at the company party, would you wear it or read it? Here clothing is text and everybody is literate. Diwali arrives with ledges lined by lamps, rows upon rows of flames turning sandstone to honey. Jahangir's memoirs remember nights that felt wider because of light, and you believe him as the Zenana becomes a river of glow. Charity hushes through the corridors. Coins and sweets, parcels for attendants' families, its path visible only by the smiles left in its wake. Lamps speak the way letters do, but their grammar is brightness. This many flames mean largesse, that corner lit means favor extended. Earlier, you learned that visibility was control. Tonight, visibility is kindness, measured in wicks and oil. Then, Nowruz, the Persian New Year. Akbar revives with a relish for spectacle, turns the courtyard into the Mina Bazaar, a market where the sellers are the women themselves, veiled in rye, posted at stalls that bloom like mirages. Bangles and embroidered purses, attars caught in little glass moons, miniatures so fine you expect to hear the sitar inside the paint. The emperor strolls and buys from his own household. With each purchase, he signals regard, gratitude, sometimes forgiveness. Coins mean nothing. Choices mean everything. One quiet stall features talismanic threads, red and gold twisted like good news. A eunuch watches ledger tucked under his arm, noting who lingers. The emperor pauses, selects 3, and for a breath, the seller's posture lifts by the thickness of a ring. A social elevator moves without ropes. Feasts spool out beside the festivals like silk from a reel. The opening dish is rice jeweled with pomegranate and lit by saffron. Then come kormas and kebabs, platters of fish, perfumed with fennel-sweet rice, studded with pistachios. This is not a buffet. It's a speech with courses. A dish tied to a Rajput homeland nods toward a recent treaty. A Persian confection tips its hat to a valued envoy. A humble lentil stew presented with ceremony thanks the city whose granaries steadied a lean year. You taste pepper and policy in the same spoonful. Seating arranges the unspoken. Cushions are coordinates. Distance is a decimal. Nearness is a headline. A senior begum close to the center signals continuity. A newcomer moved one cushion inward since last month signals ascent. A sidelined ant restored to a visible spot announces reconciliation happened somewhere off stage. Do you prefer a loud compliment or a silent cushion? Here the cushion carries heavier ink, and people read it with the attention others reserve for contracts. Entertainment threads through these gatherings with practical grace. Musicians tune ragas to match the hour, bright for the afternoon, dusky for the late lamp. Dancers' anklets chatter like polite analytics. Poetry is a second dessert. A couplet placed after the fish course might steer a conversation toward magnanimity. Another recited before lamps are lifted can fold an apology into sound. When Jahanara Begum hosts the verses, lean gently, Sufi the mood devotional without losing its polish. When Nur Jahan designs an evening, the fabric choices turn the room into policy you can touch. It's never just taste, it's governance with a shawl thrown over it. Gifts circulate like carefully trained birds. A shawl from cashmere that breathes when you fold it. An inlaid mirror whose border carries tiny carnation vines. A vial of attar whose scent folds rose into sandal as if it were a treaty. The right gift at the right moment nudges memory. A misjudged one, too grand, too sparse, too late aches like a pebble in a slipper. The harem knows this as fluently as any chancery tokens talk. Have you ever given a present that said more than your speech could manage? Imagine that scaled up to dynastic stakes. Across the festivals, the emperor's shadow moves in ways both literal and symbolic. Akbar leans into inclusion. Holy at court isn't a rumor, but a choice. Jahangir plays host with a diarist's eye, turning evenings into paragraphs that outlast the music. Shah Jahan calibrates splendor so precisely that lamps and lattices appear born for each other. Even Aurangzeb, more austere, allows ritual to frame loyalty, letting Eid's order anchor a court wary of ornament. Different rulers, same stagecraft, make feeling legible, then read it for policy. Eunuchs render all this legible to the archive that isn't one. They count the coin purse's track, who receives which robe, and notice which plate returns nearly untouched. A lack of appetite can be illness or an argument by other means. Later, when courtiers brag that they can read the emperor's face, you'll remember the guardians could read the leftovers. It's a smaller theater, but the plot twists are clearer. Not every festival rises to fireworks. Some arrive like a soft-tide birthdays, marked by private suppers. Anniversaries remembered by a miniature portrait, unveiled at the right moment. A quiet prayer day when cosmetics are pared back and voices sink a shade lower. In these smaller lights, you see why women's circles endure attention, is a currency, and ritual is its safest bank. When a senior matriarch lays her palm over a younger woman's head after the lamps are snuffed, the gesture is both blessing and receipt. Outside the palace, the city echoes these calendars with its own accents: mosques, temples, and shrines, thrumming bazaars tilting their prices like sunflowers tilting for light. Inside, the Zenana mirrors the world without copying it. You carry Holy's powder on your cuff longer than you intend. A little pink survives past midnight, tucked in a seam like a secret footnote. Later, when the lamps of Diwali paint long amber ladders across the floor, you notice how quickly steps learn to climb them. Between one feast and the next, you pause at a balcony, where sound rises like warmth. Laughter rolls, then stalls, then resumes with a different weight. Someone who was overlooked last week just received a robe of honor. Someone who was favored last month has been seated one cushion farther. You can feel the shift without seeing the ledger. If you had to choose a single instrument to describe the court drum string or wind, you'd pick the drum. Not because it's loud, but because the beat decides everything, and the melody must follow. When the music finally turns to lullabies and trays are carried out past the screens, the courtyard cools by degrees. The night air folds gently over colored powder, still caught in the cracks of the stone over lamp soot, drawn into faint halos on the ledges over a saffron thread someone tied to a pillar for luck. Eunuchs pace their measured arcs, servants stack cushions like quiet punctuation, and the fragrances rearrange themselves rows, giving way to sesame oil, cardamom, falling behind the clean hush of evening water. The festivals do their work long after they end. Favors keep walking in borrowed shoes, and color lingers where fingers forgot to dust. You follow the smell before you meet the science. Somewhere beyond the painted arch, copper alembics breathe little clouds, and a soft patter of pestles on stone mortars keeps time like a friendly metronome. The harem's healers hakims and experienced older women, the younger ones call hakimas, are at work. Part pharmacy, part perfumery, part astronomy department, with excellent lighting. You watch sesame oil glow in shallow bowls. Saffron threads fan into tiny suns, and dried rose petals collapse into powder, the color of evening. If you've ever stood in a modern skincare store, reading labels like they were poems, you already understand the vibe ritual first chemistry right behind it. Marketing not yet invented, but absolutely implied. The hammam is the quiet engine room. Marble benches hold warmth like memory, and the floors beneath you run with hidden channels, carrying heated air. Attendants scrub with ubtan, a paste of chickpea flour, turmeric and milk until skin hums. Turmeric stains fingertips a shy gold. Sandalwood paste cools hot foreheads after long afternoons under carved eaves. Nothing here is random. The older women explain how turmeric is warming, yet calms the skin, how sandalwood is cooling in both touch and temperament. You nod, because the categories sound old, but the results look new. Have you ever felt your shoulders drop after the first sip of tea? That is what a sandalwood smear does to a room. On a low shelf jars, labeled in a script that twists like vines, amla for hair strength, rose for calm, fennel for a troubled stomach, asafoetida for stubborn winds no one mentions directly. Dental care is brisk and practical. Miswak twigs to polish teeth, clove to frown, at toothache cardamom to sweeten breath before music hour. Coal is ground fresh in little boats, supposed to guard eyes from glare lined on lids as much for health as for beauty. A skeptical part of you thinks placebo. Another part watches how confidence rises when eyes turn ink dark and decides that outcome is a remedy too. The pharmacopoeia feels like an empire in miniature Persian names sharing shelves with Sanskrit ones. Arabic treatises remembered beside household lore that predates every chronicle. You hear Abul Fazl's title, Aini Akbari, invoked like a handbook. Someone quotes a passage about perfumes and kitchen discipline as if it were natural to file rosewater beside tax codes. You hear the travelers' names as well. Bernier, peeking at medical routines, with professional curiosity, Jesuit guests, noting the logic, perhaps quietly surprised that women's quarters contain so much method. History often photographs the harem as all ornament and emotion. Standing here, you can't miss the lab coat under the silk. Perfume is chemistry with a better publicist. Near the window, glazed bottles hold distilled waters. Gulab, Rose Kiora, Screwpine Mogra, Jasmine. A copper still exhales the kitchen temple smell of boiling petals, and a legend gets retold the way good legends do, gently with smiles. They say Nur Jahan loved roses so intensely that the attar's floating oil was discovered on bathwater at a summer garden, a neat story that the Tuzuki Jahangiri brushes against, while Kanauji's perfumers quietly point out they were distilling long before anyone watched bathwater. You file it under both can be true. A craft can exist for ages and still find its empress in a moment. Cosmetics read like strategy boards. Henna curls along palms in patterns that double as leisure, and language cuffs for celebration. Vines for patience, tight lattice for focus. Hair oil steep with amla hibiscus, and fenugreek massaged in with slow circles that make time itself look optional. Face pastes cool after midday prayers, saffron for radiance, before festivals fuller's earth for a face that won't collapse in monsoon humidity, almond oil where winter pinches. If you're tempted to scoff, remember the modern sheet mask and its promise to reset your entire destiny in 15 minutes. Hope, when applied topically, is a very old serum. Astrology waits at the elbow of medicine like a polite cousin. A brass astrolabe hangs from a peg, its circles catching lamplight, and a little table keeps ephemerides open to the page for tonight. The court star readers weigh hours and elements, a muhurat for first haircuts, auspicious windows for ear piercings, a cautious eye on Mars before scheduling a sea journey. Even skeptics concede the social usefulness of consensus. It's easier to start the dye bath when everyone agrees the sky is nodding. The older women consult with the palace astrologer on pregnancies. No forecasts about souls, just timing for rest herbs and privacy when tension rises like summer heat. Speaking of pregnancy, the women's wing translates empire into cradles and chores into protocols. Dayas midwives run their own quiet empire prenatal oils on the back to ease sleep, iron-rich foods slipped onto trays, pomegranates pressed into sweet medicine with the same seriousness you'd bring to a royal seal. When labor starts, rooms are warmed floors, salted for grip prayers, threaded between compresses like a second rhythm. News will travel outward carefully. Rank decides who hears first, but the human sound's breath counted lullaby rehearsed. Ignore rank entirely. You learn the small awe of an old recipe working exactly as long as attention works with it. Not every ache yields to plants and timing. For fevers that bite a physician, perhaps a court name like Hakim, Ali Gilani, is summoned, pulse taken with 3 fingertips, urine examined in a glass, held to the light as if truth had a color. A draft might carry willow and a whisper of opiate enough to turn down pain without turning off the patient. Another draft cools what they call hot blood, the vocabulary old, but the intention familiar. Do you reach for paracetamol without thinking twice? Imagine the relief when a measured powder in warm water does the same job with incense burning 2 rooms away. Talismans and textiles join the toolkit without apology. A square of cloth inked with Quranic verses folds under a pillow for protection. A red thread prayed over by a senior lady knots around a wrist not as magic, but as memory of being seen. The palace understands that morale is a medicine, and the harem has perfected its dosage. A widow who teaches embroidery receives a better lamp. A nervous singer gets jasmine water before her turn. A girl who misses her faraway mother earns a new tin of coal, and a joke at exactly the moment tears would have started. The best healers here are also archivists. They remember which oil soothed which headache. During the heavy monsoon of a year, everyone still calls the wet one. They can tell you which prince was born, on which star, and which scent calmed which temper on a night when politics trembled like a tray stacked too high. They keep no written files you can consult. The records live in wrists and shoulders and recipes that change by a pinch. It isn't vague. It's customized before that word had a market. You step back from the shelves, and the steam and the room rearranges itself into ordinary just jars, just bowls, just a still cooling on its three little legs. Somewhere in the corridor, anklets measure out a walk. Somewhere else, a pestle taps a last soft rhythm into the mortar. A smear of sandalwood dries to a pale moon on your wrist, where someone demonstrated cooling, and the skin there feels like a thought that found its answer without needing a speech. You hear the lullabies before you see the cradles, soft songs, with old words that smell of cardamom and lamp oil. And by the time you reach the nursery chambers, the air has already lowered its voice. Birth here is not just a family event. It is a constitutional moment with swaddling cloth. The Dea's midwives move like seasoned captains on a calm sea, and attendants bring warm water, sesame oil, and pomegranate sherbet with the focus of a military supply line. If you were expecting chaos, you find protocol. Instead, doors checked, lamps trimmed, whispers timed between contractions as carefully as prayers. The first thing you learn is how many calendars are involved. There is the body's calendar, which speaks in breath and heartbeat. There is the religious calendar, which counts days to the naming, the hair-cutting, the offerings to be made. And there is the palace calendar, ruled by rank and report, who gets told first which courtyard opens, how the stipend shifts for everyone tied to the mother. A quiet runner goes to the astrologer. A eunuch notes the hour down to the minute. Someone folds a silk cloth and lays out a tiny cap, as if time itself would be cold without it. Foster kin step into the room the way a shoreline appears when the tide pulls back. Wet nurses, anagas in the Mughal idiom, carry titles that weigh more than jewelry. Milk creates a second family tree. And from the day a prince takes his first breath, he is threaded into new loyalties. Akbar's household offers a famous example. His foster mother, Maham Anaga, shaped access at court so powerfully that seasoned nobles adjusted their stride when she entered a room. You watch a younger Anaga today lift a newborn with a competence that tells you politics is not only argued in halls, sometimes it is swaddled. The nursery layout speaks in soft geometry. A central cradle, often in carved wood, shaded by a small canopy, sits where light lands in a respectful spill, not harsh, not dim. Trays of beetle leaf sweets and tinkling anklets line one wall. On another, small talismans and Quranic verses, inked with neat gravity, hang beside strings of black beads, meant to distract bad attention rather than fight it. You catch a glimmer of cautious humor. Even in a palace, someone believes a silly bead can outfox envy. And perhaps that belief is a medicine of its own. Naming arrives with ceremony that smells like warm ghee and ink. A senior woman whispers the chosen name into the baby's ear. Right side first, a tiny court etiquette applied to a sleeping face. Alms go out to the poor at the gate. Sweet rice circulates from tray to tray. A coin is placed in the midwife's hand with thanks that carry both relief and precedent. You'll hear learned men quote law books later. In this room, the binding text is gratitude. The astrologer marks a lucky hour in neat script, and someone pencils a discreet star on the nursery ledger. No one says succession aloud, but the room's temperature changes as if the walls felt the word. A princess's birth does not silence the palace. It sharpens it differently. Gifts are softer fabrics, brighter, and the smiles on senior faces contain a private arithmetic. Alliances, marriages, dowries, influence through grace rather than through a throne. Jahanara Begum, born to Shah. Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal will one day coordinate relief after the Great Delhi Fire and fund inns for travelers, her name floating outside the zenana on the wings of public works. Seeing a girl's cradle does not mean seeing less consequence. It means learning to read consequence in a different font. The most delicate choreography begins once a boy survives his first vulnerable months. Tutors hover at the outer edge of the nursery like migrating birds, waiting for a season change. A small board for early writing lessons appears beside toys. A miniature bow, purely symbolic, at first leans near a silk-covered cushion. Nobody rushes the child, but nobody lets the heir forget what he may grow to be. Prince Khurram, the future Shah Jahan, was born to the Rajput princess, Jagat Gosain,